I'm Gerry Brewster, and I'm delighted to be here today with Fred Hill, who has just put out a new book, which is remarkable, that we think you all will enjoy a great deal. Fred is a longtime cover of all things political and legislative, and he has great insights. His new book is entitled Mathias of Maryland, Remembering a Lincoln Republican in the Senate. And we also want to thank Edwin Warfield and CityBiz for making this interview possible. The Warfield family has a long and distinguished history in Maryland, and they've been leaders in political and legal and publishing affairs. And his great-grandfather was governor of Maryland. So we're delighted to be here with the Warfield CityBiz group and with Fred Hill. Fred, welcome, and we're delighted to have you here to talk a little bit about your book. But let's start with your background as a journalist, author, and having worked in Washington, D.C. Tell us about yourself, Fred.
Thanks, Gerry. I'm really honored to be on the program with you, partly because of the close relationship between Senator Mathias and your father, Senator Brewster, but we can get into that later. I joined the Baltimore Sun in 1965 and spent 20 years at the Sun, 6 of them in London and Paris, covering Western Europe and Southern Africa, and then came back and was on the editorial page of the Evening Sun when there were 2 newspapers in Baltimore. And lucky for me, one day in 1985, I was planning to take a trip to the Soviet Union to learn more about it. I hadn't covered that because in those days, the Sun had 10 bureaus, including one in Moscow. And I went to see Senator Mathias to get some of his thoughts about what I should write about. And at the end of the interview, I had covered him during Watergate 10 years before, but he suddenly said, "Would you like to work for me?" And I thought about it. I said, "Well, I don't want to be a press secretary," because I knew his press secretary had just recently retired. But he said, "No, I want you to be director of foreign affairs," which meant working with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And I told him, let me think about it during this trip. And after I came back from the trip, I went to see him and said, "I would like to come to work for you." And to be fair, and an indication of how fair-minded a person he was, this was in March of 1985. He didn't decide to retire until October of that year. And at that meeting in March, he told me, "Fred, I might not run again." And he didn't, it turned out. But he asked me to keep that quiet and not mention it. And so I decided to take the job, and it was one of the best things I ever did. That he did retire in 1986 after a year and a half that I worked for him. And then even though I planned to go back to journalism, I was offered a job in the State Department where the State Department wanted to start a gaming or wargaming office. A senior official in the State Department in the Reagan years was tired of going to the Pentagon for war games that only focused on the Soviet Union's invading through the Fulda Gap or taking over oil fields in the Middle East, and he thought there were a lot more complex issues. And so they decided to start a wargaming or gaming operation to look ahead at future challenges and asked me to lead it. I hadn't had much experience in it, but it turned out they were more interested in the context of scenarios than they were in the mechanisms of wargaming. And 2 years after I joined the State Department, I was offered the job to head the office. And I accepted that, and I stayed there for 20 years, even though I drove to Washington from Baltimore for 20 years. But it was a fascinating job, and I'm very glad I took it.
Fred, this new book that you've just put out on Mac Mathias is a fascinating book, and it's different than a traditional biography. Tell us about that. Tell us about the nature of this book.
Well, Gerry, I thought 10 years ago, probably more than that there should be a biography of Mac Mathias, given what an exemplary figure and public servant he was. And I thought somebody that had been on his staff a lot longer than I had would do that, but then nobody did. Then Trump came along, and I saw the decline in the Republican Party and its respect for the rule of law. And that was 5 or 6 years ago. And I felt then, well, a biography should come out. Now, I didn't have time because I was working on 2 other books, one with my son, a book called A Flick of Sunshine. And I just didn't have time to spend 4 or 5 years doing the research that would be required to write a truly in-depth biography by one person. So I thought back to a book I had done in 2016, The Life of Kings, which is a book on the Baltimore Sun. And I decided to use the template I used for that book with Stephen Browning, my good friend and op-ed page editor of the Sun. And he and I put together a book, The Life of Kings, with 27 different chapters by Steve and myself and other leading people that worked for the Sun in the great days of the Sun from the 60s to turn of the century, I guess, more or less. But those included Joe Stern, Bob Timberg, John Carroll, David Simon, Steve Luxembourg, a whole host of Kevin Callagher, the great cartoonist. And I decided that I would do the same thing with Mathias. And we had trouble, my co-editor, Monica Healy, I decided when to do this, I needed to find somebody that had worked for Mac Mathias longer than I had. And she was a senior legislative aide for 12 years. So we had a terrific bit of teamwork. And we put together a book which I maintain is just as good as a traditional biography because almost all chapters were written by people who were senior aides to Mac Mathias and times of his highest achievements on civil rights, voting rights, Chesapeake Bay recovery, which Monica had worked as a senior official on, his early criticism of Nixon and the Vietnam War, although he then led the effort to establish the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, and all through his great positions on crime and punishment questions, on the rule of law, on a number of foreign policy issues ranging from nuclear weapons control to the Middle East peace efforts and the South Africa sanctions bill, which is something that we accomplished in the year and a half that I was with him when he led the Republican effort to find a bipartisan agreement with the Democrats and pass that sanctions bill over Reagan's veto.
Fred, Mac Mathias was known for being a civil rights champion, particularly in the 1960s when he served in the House of Representatives when some very important legislation was coming through Congress. Tell us about Mac Mathias's role with regard to civil rights and the legislation that was coming through.
Well, in his first and second years in the House of Representatives as a freshman and sophomore congressman, he and John Lindsay, who was also a young congressman from New York, the later mayor of New York, worked with a senior representative from Ohio, William McCullough, to press for a remarkable comprehensive civil rights legislation that really is very close to what eventually passed as the Civil Rights Act. And these were Republicans pushing for civil rights at a time when both Kennedy and later Johnson were somewhat shy and skittish about pushing the civil rights legislation because of the Southern Dixiecrats. As you recall, before the Nixon Southern strategy, the Democrats had a large number of senators and congressmen from the South who were Democrats, and they were very much opposed to any civil rights legislation. But the legislation that Mathias, Lindsay, and McCullough pressed is very much resembles the Civil Rights Act that did pass in 1964. He also was a very active supporter of voting rights all through his life, right up until after he had retired. He came to testify late in his life before Ben Cardin on renewing the voting rights bill.
Fred, you mentioned earlier on that Mac was an early opponent of the Vietnam War and that subsequently he was a leader in getting a national Vietnam Veterans Memorial established in D.C. What do you think caused Mac Mathias to come out so early against the Vietnam War and then want to honor those who fought thereafter?
Well, he had a deep respect for American history, understanding of it, leaders, the Constitution. He also had served in the military during World War II, as your father had. They both left college in 1942, not much more than a year after Pearl Harbor. Your father served in the Marines. Mac was in the U.S. Navy, and he had very strong impressions. He visited Hiroshima after the war. And I just think he, even though he opposed the escalation of the war under Kennedy and Johnson, he then, in the late 70s, came to lead the effort to establish the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And despite opposition from many in the Reagan Republican administration at the time, what happened was two Vietnam vets named Scruggs and Dubeck came to Mathias at some point, I believe in the 70s. They were both from Maryland, and asked him if he would lead the effort to establish a memorial. And he did. He smartly lined up with John Warner of Virginia, a former Secretary of the Navy, and the two of them got it done. And there was a lot of opposition, particularly to the design of the memorial by a very young, I believe, Yale architecture or art student. And there was a lot of opposition led by James Watt in the Reagan administration. And it was a very controversial period, but Mathias and Warner got this passed. And it's, obviously it's definitely one of the most striking memorials in the world today.
Fred, Mac Mathias was a Republican United States Senator, but he was very popular with the Democrats. And he always got reelected in Democratic Maryland. What was Mac Mathias's relationship with President Nixon? And did Senator Mathias support the Watergate investigation, which was investigating President Nixon?
Yes, a brief note at the beginning of that. He won all 8 elections as a Republican in a heavily Democratic state because of how much of a bipartisan-minded person he was with a deep moral and political compass. He fought for bipartisan actions on foreign policy, but equally he was very determined to work on social problems and economic inequities in the country, environmental reforms, and that appealed to people in a state that, even though it's heavily Democratic, have a lot of interest in, I think, a lot of middle-of-the-road people. He was an early critic of Nixon and Watergate. In fact, in the book, Mathias of Maryland, I basically excerpted a chapter, an interview I did with him in November of 1973, long before it was clear that Nixon would resign or be forced to face impeachment. And in that interview, he not only called for Nixon to come clean, but he also warned that Nixon was leading the country down the road to dictatorship. And in fact, one of my favorite quotes that I put in the front piece of the book is a comment he made during Watergate, not during that interview, I think, in which he said, and I think it's very pertinent today, there have been actions over the past few years that have caused some in positions of power and responsibility to forget that the highest loyalty of an American public servant is not to any personality, whether he be president or general or senator, nor to any organization, agency, or party. Its first loyalty is to the law of the land, built upon constitutional foundations by Jefferson, Washington, Hamilton, George Mason, and other great men of our revolutionary past. And that, to me, is a signature of the kind of person Mac Mathias is, and what is no longer true of the Republican Party: a respect for American history, the rule of law, and a bipartisan foreign policy.
Fred, Mac took his legislative responsibilities seriously, and one of the passions that he had was for our much beloved Chesapeake Bay. What did Senator Mathias do with regard to trying to turn around the decline of the Chesapeake Bay, and has his legacy endured?
It has, and I think Monica Healy wrote the chapter on that because she was his senior assistant at that time in 1983. As a child, he had gone with his parents and toured the bay and was struck by all the fish and different things beneath the water and his visits there, and it carried through his career. And he was always a strong proponent of environmental efforts. And in the early 80s, he undertook strenuous efforts to lead the efforts to pass legislation and appropriations, more importantly, against the opposition in the Reagan administration to this kind of reform and recovery of the Bay, as the Bay was suffering terrible uh, deterioration from runoff, industrial waste, and other problems on the shore. Uh, the key turning point might have been when in 1983 he invited William Ruckelshaus, who was an environmentalist who had worked in the Nixon administration and Reagan had appointed as EPA administrator. He invited Ruckelshaus to tour the bay with on a boat. I think maybe the Governor Hughes at the time had a boat that they may have later sold, but they toured the bay with a number of other senators. Chuck Robb from Virginia, William Scranton was on there. He may have been Lieutenant Governor of Pennsylvania at the time, but Paul Sarbanes and that tour really convinced Ruckelshaus to support Mathias's efforts to pass the Chesapeake Bay recovery. And the book covers, Monica Healy wrote the chapter 4, also quotes Tom Horton as attributing much of the recovery of the Bay and improvements. It's obviously not over in the efforts to clean up the Bay, but Tom credits Senator Mathias as having been the leader of that effort.
Fred, Mac Mathias was very interested in our nation's laws, and he served on a number of committees, Judiciary Committee included. And at a time in our nation's history where the solution to crime was thought to be laws that essentially led to mass incarceration, Mac Mathias viewed things differently at that time. How so?
Well, it's a good example of his moral courage, something that President Biden, he gave the eulogy at Mac Mathias's memorial service in 2010, and Joe Biden refers to Mac's moral courage as having been uh, a motivation that was undergirded his career. But the, the biggest sign of that was during the bit of not sure of the dates themselves, but in the Reagan administration, both the Reagan administration and Democrats, including Joe Biden, were very determined to pass sweeping crime legislation to deal with, obviously, the increasing crime and drug use that was going on across the country. But they proposed such sweeping legislation that Mac Mathias just opposed the extremes to which they were going. And he predicted during those hearings that if they passed this legislation, it would lead to a doubling, tripling, and even quadrupling of prison populations in the country. This is covered in the director of the domestic side of Mathias's office, Steve Metalitz's chapter in the book, perfectly. And one of the key points was it showed Mathias's courage was that when the final bill was up for legislation, it passed 89-1. The one person who stood up and voted against this sweeping legislation was Mac Mathias.
Fred, you had the opportunity to serve as Mac Mathias's chief foreign affairs advisor, and you had a young assistant working for you named Chris Van Hollen, now a United States Senator, holding Mac Mathias's seat. And Mac, as you mentioned earlier, held my father's old Senate seat. Mac was very respected internationally in seeking Mideast peace, ending apartheid in South Africa, containing nuclear weapons, and so much more. Tell us about Mac Mathias's view on foreign policy. What were his general guiding principles that he looked at and followed when he was trying to resolve these difficult foreign policy issues?
Well, again, he had this deep respect for American history, and it's leadership in the world, I might just quote from a chapter in the book, and it might take a minute to find it, but the in a speech which I think captures his positions that he gave to the City Club in San Diego in 1973. He said, an American foreign policy does not need to be manipulative or brutal to succeed. What is required in our foreign policy leaders is a deep understanding of the history, behavior, policies, and resources of other nations and peoples. And even more important, a full understanding of the purposes of the Constitution, the course of American history, and the beliefs of the American people. He also was heavily influenced by his experience, as your father was, I'm sure, in World War II. And he visited Hiroshima after the war. And what he said he actually wrote a letter to his parents after visiting Hiroshima, in which he said, Hiroshima has to seem to be believed. The thought that what was done there was done by a single bomb is frightening and awesome. Hiroshima looks like some malevolent giant had pounded it all to dust with an enormous mallet. He was affected by that, and he also felt that as the leader in the world, and remember, he was in the Senate at a time when the United States was in a head-to-head contest with the Soviet Union, but also just before the Soviet Union collapsed. So he was very concerned and often visited the Soviet Union to understand their foreign policy and work for control and reduction of nuclear weapons. Sam Nunn who's a leader in the Senate at the time on nuclear weapons, tributes Mac with being a great asset to the country and to him in pressing for legislation. And even Ronald Reagan came around to support not only détente, but also the reduction of nuclear weapons in his term, and that probably is his enduring legacy. He and George H.W. Bush and their handling of the a fulfillment of some of those nuclear accords, which are now in genuine threat because of Vladimir Putin. But he really was determined to help keep and retain American leadership in the world. And that's why he went to the Middle East once. When I was there in 1986, we visited the 5 of the countries in the Middle East: Saudi Arabia, Syria, Jordan, Israel, and Egypt. And he met with all the leaders of those countries. Another former aide of his, Cassius, and I accompanied him on those trips. And they all shared deep respect for Mathias because he was such a thoughtful, engaged, and independent voice on the Middle East. He was both in favor of Israel's sovereignty, but also in favor of making sure that Arab countries had a right to similar futures, and he was respected by both Arab and Israeli leaders. In fact, Yitzhak Rabin, the then prime minister of Israel, shared with him some upcoming details about the Iran-Contra scandal in private. And he also was the first, I believe, first American president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, because he had such deep respect in Europe among all the leaders there. And both the French and British prime ministers came to an event in 1986 as a tribute in Baltimore to Mathias's career once he had announced that he was going to retire. And those are small examples of the deep respect he had around the world, frankly.
Fred, one of Mac Mathias's great legacies was his bipartisan cooperation. He was well known for working with Democrats, working with Republicans, reaching out a hand across the aisle to do what was in the nation's best interest. In fact, Joe Biden said, with Mac Mathias, there was no aisle. He worked with everybody to put the people first and the country first. What would Mac Mathias think of Congress today?
I don't think he'd like it. I don't think he'd like it. I just give you one example, Gary, and it's when Chris Van Halen and I were I was the Foreign Affairs director, and Chris was my deputy. He just graduated from the Kennedy School of Government, and he covered defense and arms control issues, and I covered the broader range of foreign policy issues. But at the time, the Democrats were all in favor of a very sweeping bill to deal with South Africa because of all the turmoil there, the atrocities, the number of black South Africans who were being killed in different demonstrations and by the government. And the Democrats had a very sweeping bill. Mathias led the effort to tone down that bill somewhat. One of the things that the Democrats wanted to do was close the U.S. Embassy in South Africa, which was not a good idea. And there were several things that Chris and I worked on at the time, which led to passage of the South Africa sanctions bill by the Senate. Ronald Reagan vetoed the bill. Reagan had favored something called constructive engagement, which was a very polite term for going along with the white minority regime in South Africa, not criticizing them too harshly or passing tough sanctions. These sanctions not only called for the release of Nelson Mandela, but would eliminate all economic aid to South Africa, military exchanges, and so forth, so on and so forth. Reagan vetoed that bill. Mathias and Daniel Evans and Richard Lugar of Indiana, who came around to the view of Mathias and Evans, they led 31 Republicans to join 47 minority Democrats to pass that bill over Reagan's veto, 78-21, at the height of Ronald Reagan's popularity. Can you imagine that happening today? I mean, Norm Ornstein, well, we can talk about that, has a view of what we should think of today's Republican Party. Norm Ornstein, in his marvelous foreword for the book, and he's one of the leading scholars on American politics, and he, both in the book and in on the Tom Hall show recently, said there's not one Republican in the Senate or House today that measures up to Mac Mathias or Jack Javits or Ed Brooke of Massachusetts, Catfield, Bill Cohen of Maine. There's not one Republican in Washington today that measures up to their moral and political courage and leadership.
Fred, I think that your analysis of how Senator Mathias would feel about Congress today is very accurate. It is discouraging to everyone to see the lack of functionality that exists. And somebody like Mac Mathias would have fought against that dysfunction. One quick thing I want to mention, you mentioned my father, and it is pretty incredible, the relationship between those two men. And to be clear, Mac Mathias is the person that defeated my father and knocked my father out of the United States Senate. But my father continued to have great respect for Mac Mathias, as did I. And after I graduated from college, I actually went to work for Mac Mathias. So many of these issues are close to my heart as well. And my father supported that effort. And you mentioned bipartisanship. Here's just one quick story about that. After Senator Mathias defeated my father, and there was the next Democratic presidential inauguration was actually Jimmy Carter's in 1976. And my father was sort of down and out. And Mac Mathias called him up, his defeated former Democratic senator that he knocked out and a good friend of his. And he said, Danny, I want you to come back to Washington, and I want you to walk down the Senate aisle with me and march into the President Carter's inauguration with me. And my father said, oh, Mac, thank you, but nobody's going to want to see me. And he said, yes, they will, Danny. And Mac Mathias insisted that my father join him for the inauguration and walk with him side by side. That was a Republican inviting a defeated Democrat to a presidential inauguration. That's the kind of man Mac Mathias was, a man of great integrity. And Fred, as we close up this interview, is there anything else you want to say that we haven't talked about that you think is important for people to know about your wonderful new book?
Yeah, thank you very much. No, I think the one thing I would is quote, ironically, in the book and long before Edwin, I've watched City Biz List for a number of years, but uh, quite ironically, in Warfield's magazine in 1986, Alan Crawford, who ended up writing a book called Thunder of the Right, offered a succinct and striking assessment of Mike Mathias in an essay. And I'll end with this quote because it really captures, I think, and I'm glad I found it when I did my research to write the biographic profile that I wrote, drafted, and then Monica filled in a lot of the domestic details, and I ended up finishing off with his extraordinary retirement, by the way, at the age 64. Imagine that, Chuck Grassley, who's in his 90s. Anyway, Crawford wrote in Warfield's magazine, endowed with a sense of history, motivated more by an ethic of public service than personal striving, Mathias has brought to his political career qualities of personal decency and independence of judgment, which has served him and the nation well at a time when Congress all too often seems dominated by hustlers and opportunists. Hustlers and opportunists strikes me as a pretty mild way of describing the current Republican membership in the House and Senate.
Your latest book, Mathias of Maryland, Remembering a Lincoln Republican in the Senate, is a fascinating book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I want to thank you, Fred, for participating in this interview. I want to thank Edwin Warfield and CityBiz for making this interview possible. And to each and every one of you, I hope you'll get the opportunity to read Fred Hill and Monica Healy's new book, Mathias of Maryland. Thank you all for joining in.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Edwin.